Member Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
So the debate that Congress and the Senate will have to have is whether or not White House policy is enough. I think they're well-intentioned. I think they want to fix a problem that exists. But we've had this conversation before. In about 2010, 2011, when the avian flu was mutated to become aerosolized and more easily spread among mammals, there was a pause between 2014 and 2016. But throughout the pause, there were exemptions given to many research, and then there's some research that mysteriously just doesn't show up in any documents. So, for example, the research in Wuhan that many of us believe evidence points towards the lab leak causing the pandemic was never reviewed. We then set up a committee called the P3CO committee, which was supposed to be in charge of looking at the safety of dangerous research. They looked at exactly 3 research projects. They complained and said, well, we didn't have the ability to go out and grab research. We could only take what was given to us. So there are limitations of the internal changes. In fact, one of the grave mistakes that was made is that the research in Wuhan was never even looked at by the P3CO committee. It was never paused. And Anthony Fauci will say, my people up and down told me it was not gain of function. And yet there's not one scrap of paper of any discussion ever occurring over whether it was gain of function or not. There have been camps for a long time. People say, oh, is this Republicans versus Democrats? No, but it's contentious, and there have been scientists on both sides of this from the very beginning. Really, probably all the way back to the Spanish flu in 2005, but certainly since 2007. And people need to realize that there are people on polar extremes, and Anthony Fauci was a polar extreme. He believed, and he said in 2012, that even if a pandemic should occur, the knowledge was worth it. So I guess my question to begin for Dr. Redfield was, do you think that taking a coronavirus, the backbone of a SARS coronavirus, and swapping out S proteins from unknown viruses, do you think that's research that should be scrutinized for potentially being gain of function or dangerous? Does it bother you that the internal regulations that were put in place didn't seem to work to catch that Wuhan research?
Yes. I think the problem is the program can't be passive. And I think while I respect some of the improvements that happened with the May decisions that the White House has, I still think this is sort of a passive volunteer program for compliance. And so clearly, I think there has to be a much more active engagement. And one of the things that I want to come back to that I said earlier, and people will disagree with me, but I think they should reflect on what I'm about to say. In 2024, 2025, biosecurity is our nation's greatest national security threat. You need to think of it the same way we thought about the verge of nuclear, atomic, in the late 40s, 50s, and 60s. And, you know, Congress and our country was very aggressive in putting some standards around how we did nuclear research and where we did it. I think we have to have that same vigor towards this biological gain of function research right now. It has the potential to be much more catastrophic than, let's say, an isolated nuclear event.
So in preparing this bill to set up an independent board, we interviewed dozens of scientists. We asked them their opinions on this, what has to be done differently. And probably the number one thing people came back to us is that they believe the people making the judgment on the danger of the research should not be people dispensing money or receiving money, because it's just a conflict of interest. And accusations have been made. We don't know what people's motivations are, but when there are multi-million-dollar awards being given after certain opinions change or evolve over time, then the question is whether or not the money motivates the change. And really, so what we did in setting the independent commission up that we hope to pass into legislation is to have people who have, are no longer receiving, they could have been working for NIH, but they're no longer receiving benefits. They're not in the dispensing part, to try to get more objective look at this. We also put people on the committee that would have a national security look at this as well. And they can have both. People like Dr. Redfield have had both experiences of looking at national security and the science of this. And also, we don't ban anything. We don't ban gain of function research. It's really important what the definition is, and it requires some guidances and then scientists. But to Dr. Esvelt, do you think it's important that this be outside of the traditional NIH grant funding process and to get rid of conflict of interest, or do you think it can be done with in-house at NIH?
Thank you, Senator. I strongly believe that to provide trustworthy oversight, it has to be located outside the chains of funding, in either direction, exactly as you outlined.
Dr. Rusfeld, the history of this, if you could sort of review again, just because some people think this started with COVID, going back to Spanish flu and avian flu, that there's been really a long-running debate in the scientific community about the benefits. Some people say, well, as Anthony Fauci, the knowledge is always worth it, the risk doesn't matter, the knowledge is worth it. But then other people say we've never developed any vaccines from gain-of-function research and that it hasn't been nearly as productive as some would argue. Can you comment a little bit on the history of this debate, where the debate's going, and what your opinion is on Dr. Redfield? I'm sorry, I was directing that one back to Dr. Redfield.
I think it's an important debate to have, and I think you've highlighted. If I was sitting here 20 years ago, I would probably have the view that we may want to consider gain-of-function research as a way for us to get a jump start on countermeasures, because the pace of science was so slow. I know when I became CDC director, I was very concerned about a bird flu pandemic. And historically, if that occurred, it would likely take several years before we would have a vaccine or countermeasure. And so really for the first couple of years, it would just be a body count. But I will say the pace of science today is such that, and we saw it obviously with the COVID pandemic and the rapid development of the COVID vaccines, is such that we can really develop countermeasures really in weeks and months now. So I'm not of the view that we get such a jump start with gain-of-function research. And I do think there has to be a very aggressive debate of whether there's any benefit from that research. I think you are right. I'm not aware of any advanced therapeutic or vaccine that has come to pass because of gain-of-function research. So I'm still reticent. I do want to have a vigorous public debate about its benefit, and if it's determined that it has benefit, and I want society to be involved in that debate, not just scientists, then how do we do it in a safe, responsible, and effective way that protects our national security, which I do believe it has to be highly regulated.
Thank you. Senator Johnson, recognized for